was sitting around a bonfire with a bunch of artists, and we were talking about self-portraiture when I rashly dismissed it as some sort of narcissistic folly. And I woke up later that night sweating, wondering, what on earth was I, a person who'd never made a self-portrait, even talking about? Of course, therein lay this challenge to make a self-portrait. A challenge which I accepted because I knew I had to make one if I was ever going to talk about self-portraiture again. And so I did. And it changed my life. So this is how that journey began years ago. A journey which has culminated in what I've come to call Eradicate the self-portrait. Now, first understand, as an artist, I'd never been interested in rendering the self, especially myself. My art was devoted to material and material imagination, what kind of stories materials tell, and how to make those stories clear. Basically, I saw my work as channels for other voices, non-human voices. But now I had this really strange tool. I had this mold of my own head, and I could open it up, I could look inside, and think about what I was going to fill it with. Bronze, lead, clay. It could be anything, really. Eventually, I decided on crystal clear resin because I wanted to make a statement about light and about transparency. And I really loved how this thing messed with scale and how my head turned into a lens that turned the world upside down and backwards. You can see the clouds there in the upper sky are actually drifting through my cheek and my lower jaw, whereas the sand below is actually projecting across the top of my head like the night sky. Now, before I go further, I want to stop to consider something. Human beings are really obsessed with control. We build roads, we build houses, dams, works of art, and we expect these things. We demand, really, that they last. It's built into our codes, it's built into our contracts. And as an artist, my job for the last several years has not only been to make art, but to ensure that when people purchase it, it remains as it is on the day that they bought it. It's acid-free, archival, light-fast. And then once we make it, we have all these systems that are set up to protect art by keeping it separate from the environment. We put it into frames behind glass. Our museums are light, temperature, humidity controlled. All this so that art will remain as it is forever. Now, when I set out to make this self-portrait, I started with 3 assumptions about what I thought self-portraiture should be. It should look like me. It should suggest something unique about my interests. And 3, should endure unchanged. So I present to you a perfect self-portrait. Right? It looks like me, it's unique, and it's enduring. Why then did I begin to loathe it? Despite meeting all 3 of these criteria, it failed. I began to suspect that it was being limited by my assumptions of what it should be, rather than being freed up by what it could be. The obvious answer is that I'd chosen the wrong material. Crystal clear resin is horribly toxic, and making a self-portrait out of an enduringly toxic material is just a bad idea, right? The less obvious answer, though, was that I hadn't thought through what the self is. This thing that we all have some sort of a sense of, but that we can't put our finger on. Is it a material? Is it an energy? How does it behave? What kind of material could I fill this mold up with that would correspond with this mystery material of the self? I had lots of examples that I could refer to from art history. And while I love many of these self-portraits, I found them largely useless as templates in my own search. See, it turns out that when it comes to figuring out how to best render the self, we have to figure that out for ourselves. Only I could best navigate through this particular conundrum. So I went back to the drawing board, which so happened to be this beautiful stream deep in the mountains of eastern Oregon. And I sat down next to this stream, and I picked up this stone. It was this beautiful sculpture all by itself. And I was wondering, at what rate is this river sculpting this stone? And as I was contemplating this, turning it in my hands, I realized it was roughly the size of my own head. It's this light bulb moment, right? I ran back to my studio and I got a bucket and I got some cement and I got sand and gravel from the bank of the river and I made a head of concrete. And then I stuck an eye bolt into it, and once it had cured, I tied a long rope to it and I threw it out into the river. You see, my idea was that I was going to use this mold of this cast of my head to measure the river's erosion of stone. I'd pull it out every couple weeks, I'd measure it with calipers, and slowly over time, I'd learn the answer to my question. But something totally unexpected happened. I threw this head out into the river, it's about 30 pounds of concrete, and it didn't sink. Instead, the river snatched it up and pummeled it down the stream bed, and I ran after it through the bushes, holding on for dear life to this big rope that you see here. And several hundred feet down the river, I pulled it out, and this is what I looked like. In that short amount of time, it had removed my chin, my nose, my ears. I was unrecognizable. But I looked a lot like that stone that I'd been admiring just a few days before. And when I pulled it in, even though I was unrecognizable, I saw myself there. This head, diminished in size, was no less me than I am myself. And I was now in 3 places. I was in my body, I was in this reshaped head that I cradled in my hands, and I was in all those fragments that the river had broken off and that were now rushing off down to the ocean. Or no, wait, I was actually still in one place, but the boundaries of what I considered self had expanded dramatically. It was in that moment I became stone, I became river, I became limitless. All these boundaries that had existed before, suddenly they dissolved. This portrait had entered into the flow of energy. It became energy. It was at play with time, and as such, was going to continue to expand and be shaped by nature, as we all are. You see, I had mistakenly assumed that self was a material. Instead, I found it was energy as revealed by process. This is like that wonderful question that we're all introduced to in elementary physics. Is light a wave or is it a particle? Well, of course, we know they're both. Is the self matter or process? It's both. This wonderful thing happened. This boundary between material and process became provisional. All these years, I had mistakenly assumed that the self was permanent, and I'd conflated it with my body. But it's not permanent. We change, we grow, we die, and it's tied to the rest of the world. So the self can't be confused with the body either. It was with that moment that I realized that the actual reason that my resin head had failed was that I thought that it should endure unchanged, which actually violates the very nature of the self. And with that epiphany, I began to make self-portraits, which I gave back to the environment so that forces within that environment could then complete them. I moved from these geophysical appetites of the river to more familiar appetites, those of animals, and I began to make all these self-portraits out of food. Portraits out of millet and sunflower seeds I gave back to the birds. In this case, I became Steller's jays, and I extended out to the very furthest reaches of their flight. Heads that I made out of fish food, I gave to a pond in an ancient Chinese garden where they were consumed by ornamental carp. I merged with the symbolic legacy of a Chinese garden. This head that I made out of dried fish, millet, Rice Krispies, honey, I gave to the night where it was ravaged by this black bear. And a few days later, I'm walking through the forest, and I found myself transformed by a bear's intestines. And as I'm leaning over, I'm admiring this new, very redolent me, this butterfly, this beautiful Lorquin's admiral, flutters down, lands on the scat, unfurls its proboscis, and begins to eat. I became a butterfly. Every transformation is a form of self-portrait. These portraits look like me. They just don't look like the me that I see in the mirror. They look like the environment. The self is environment. In 2012, I had the opportunity to have a solo exhibition at the Suzhou Museum in China. And I devoted an entire room to a video installation of animals eating these self-portraits. And one afternoon, this old man sought me out to tell me his reaction to this video of birds eating my head. As a teenager in 1958, he had participated in this massive Mao-directed campaign called Eradicate the Sparrows campaign. It was determined that the birds were eating too much grain. And so this man, along with millions of others, took to the countryside and they shot the birds, they stoned them, they ruined their nests, beat on pots and pans and blew on musical instruments, all sorts of things to keep those birds from resting until they simply died from exhaustion. To give you a sense of scale, 1.7 billion birds were killed. The birds, of course, did eat some grain, but they ate a lot of locusts. The next year, the locusts descended, but the birds were gone, and the locusts ate all the grain. In the famine that followed the largest famine of the 20th century, every single member of this old man's family died, leaving him all alone in the world. And at this point in the conversation, he's holding both of my hands, gripping my hands very tightly, very emotional. He said, "I killed my entire family by killing birds. It's my fate to meet you today. We're opposites. We're linked." And so we are. But we're not linked as opposites. His campaign has a name, has a date, and it was catastrophic. But it would be foolish to think that it's somehow a unique event. Instead, that campaign is simply a concentrated expression of a far larger campaign that sadly all of us are participating in. That campaign is fueled by our belief that permanence is necessary and that the self need to be understood as separate from the environment. Our campaign doesn't have a name, it doesn't have a date, but the effects are far more catastrophic if you consider the current rates of mass extinction and ecological collapse around the world. My early resin head looks like me, but its statement is as miscalculated as the Eradicate the Sparrows campaign. The latter heads, though, those of seed and foods, they succeeded because I abandoned my assumption that permanence is necessary and that the self need to remain unchanged by the environment. These pieces were set up intentionally to disappear. They're traceless. They remain only as expansion, like ripples from a stone being cast into water. The final stage of each of these is a landscape. This is my self-portrait. We have to begin to understand that the self is environment. We have to begin to see it that way if we are going to better assess if we like what we see, and if not, how are we going to change it for the better? So I ask you, what would your environmental self-portrait look like? What parts of you have become your environment, your home, your community, your world? I ask you to consider the possibility that the environment is a critical component of who you are, and vice versa. This is the view of Eradicate the self-portrait. So the next time that you're sitting around a bonfire or you're sitting out on your porch and the person next to you points up to the beautiful sky above, tell them it's a self-portrait. Tell them that they helped make it. And I promise you, this won't be a statement of narcissistic folly. We're all shaping and being shaped by our environment. And our portraits endure not through permanence, but through expanding out into our world. And it is this measure of self, of how well we have given back, which will, in the end, be the only measure worth taking. Thank you.